So let's put our devastating wounds, lethal hits and twin-linked weapons under the microscope. Just how much more damage do the new weapon keywords of 40k 10th edition really add? Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking 40k weapon keywords, and I thought in this video we'd do a little bit more in-depth analysis on the new changes to weapon rules that we're getting in 10th. Along with a whole bunch of other changes to the game, these new changes to the weapon rules are something that's going to be popping up in just about every army in 40k. Currently in 9th edition we've got our very familiar ones, things like Assault, Rapid Fire and Heavy. But then for most abilities, bar things like Blast, they generally have a fully written out explanation on the weapon itself on each and every profile, as opposed to some sort of consolidated system that draws from the main book, which looks like what we're going to be getting. These weapon keywords still have the standard ones that we're used to, things like Assault, Rapid Fire and Heavy, though it does look like they're able to be combined in unusual and new ways, such as having Assault pistol weapons on those spine gaunts, or an Assault heavy weapon in the Space Marine bolt rifle. It looks like we'll also get keywords for previous common abilities like Ignoring Cover, Blast or Precision, the new version of the Sniper rule. But perhaps one of the most interesting things that they've done for 10th edition is they seem to have added really quite a lot of keyworded type rules that actually just amplify the main damage of the weapon. These are things like Devastating Wounds, Lethal Hits, Twin Linked and Sustained Hits. Some of these might have been on weapon profiles or special rules before, or a lot of them might have been given by characters or stratagems. We've probably got a fair amount more to come though that we haven't even seen yet, maybe things like Skyfire and damage buffs against aircraft, or other mechanics like say increasing the AP on a wound roll of 6 or something. With that in mind, in this video I thought it would be interesting to take a look through these different weapon keywords and see just how much damage they potentially add to a weapon, which I'll generally talk about in terms of percentage damage increase. Obviously at this point, without points or the full rules or anything, it won't be telling us whether individual weapons are strong or weak. It's far too early to say that sort of thing, but I feel like it might be kind of helpful interpreting just how strong these weapon rules are if you do find them applied to your units when the indexes come out. I feel like it's perhaps particularly interesting for any armies that might be able to pick up a certain buff, say like the Lethal Hits one that Space Marines can get via a lieutenant. It is going to be helpful to know how much that might add to your standard unit. So starting out with the weapon keywords, we've got a nice simple one in Sustained Hits. This is the one that we've seen on this Eldar Shuriken cannon, which gives you extra hits on 6s to hit. The rule allows you to vary it. I'd imagine for most weapons it's likely just going to be Sustained Hits 1. We do have a fair few examples of things where Sustained Hits 2 basically already exists in 40k though, things like Necron Tesla weapons. This one basically just adds extra damage to a gun, though lowers the damage onto 6s, so it means that the weapons will be a little bit more swingy. If you look out and roll a 6 or 2, then it's going to punch up big, but if you get unlucky and roll none, then it's going to underwhelm. If a gun were to suddenly acquire Sustained Hits, then relative to its current damage output, the thing that's actually going to determine how powerful this is how bad your ballistic skill is. If you had something like a current 40k Orc, whose gun's going to be balanced around hitting on 5+, getting this rule would be absolutely excellent, as it basically adds an extra 50% to your damage output. 1 out of every 2 hits that you get is going to trigger this, and Orcs generally tend to have a lot of shots to make up for their bad ballistic skill. It's still good if you're hitting on 4s though, getting you an extra 33% damage, 25% on a 3+, like Space Marines, or I guess like this Dark Reaper with the Shuriken cannon, and it's perhaps going to be less impactful on Custodes, where you're hitting on 2s, only a plus 20% increase in damage, not bad when it takes effects, but quite a lot of your hits aren't going to trigger the Sustained Hits rule. I did find it kind of interesting that it looks like Sustained Hits is going to be a thing for Shuriken cannons for Eldar. It is more or less just a flat buff to the amount of hits that you can expect on the target, and it maybe seems a bit weird to have that actually baked into a gun's main profile, as opposed to have something that you add on through like a leader's buff. In terms of interactions, my guess would be that it probably won't stack with Lethal Hits, the one where 6s to hit auto wound. Seems like that'll probably be a bit of unhelpful synergy, and that's currently banned in 9th edition 40k. I feel it's unlikely that they'd de-restrict it in 10th. And the possibility of having higher Sustained Hits rolls is really quite interesting. Things like Necron Tesla weapons and the like could have some interesting synergies with that. If you've got Sustained Hits 2 or better, and you get access to any sort of full hit reroll, then provided your ballistic skill is a 3+ or better, then the maths works out that you should reroll all the dice if you can, and just try and fish for more 6s, as that will be better than just rerolling misses. Overall though, Sustained Hits just looks like a fairly straightforward flat damage boost to the target, maybe one of the least complicated of the new buffs. Next up, and also one of the more simple ones, we've got Heavy Weapons. The new version of the Heavy Weapon has been reframed from taking a penalty of -1 to hit if you move about, to now giving you a +1 to hit provided the model is stationary. It doesn't look like there's any exception for certain unit types like now. Currently it's just infantry that take the moving and firing heavy weapon penalty. And my guess would be that this probably isn't going to apply to literally every single heavy weapon that has the heavy keyword at the moment. I'd guess things like most weapons on vehicles probably aren't going to get this rule. I think the only vehicle-mounted heavy weapon that we've seen at the moment is the Hunter-Killer Missile on the Rhino, and that didn't get this. My guess would be it might be for certain primary weapons on tanks maybe, that ideally need to be stationary to fire them, and probably infantry-mounted heavy weapons for the most part, things like Devastator squads, though apparently also the new bolt rifle. In terms of how much extra damage this one's going to give, heavy weapons again are going to be more valuable on things that don't hit very well in 40k. A 3+ ballistic skill would go to a 2+, so that would be a 25% damage increase, compared with if you move and fire the unit for example, and for a ballistic skill 4+ unit it would be an extra 33% damage. This one does run up against the limitations of a d6 dice roll though, it wouldn't be any change whatsoever to ballistic skill 2+, I'm sure that ones will still be failing automatically. So I'd guess that any weapons with a 2+ weapon or ballistic skill probably won't get the heavy keywords, as it'd be kind of irrelevant and wouldn't give you any extra benefit. I feel like the change of this from a penalty to a buff is kind of interesting. I guess makes it a little bit more of a feels-good mechanic, though realistically the outcome might be kind of the same. The units are going to be priced for their damage output, and whether you're going from a ballistic skill 4+ to a 3+, or 3+ to a 2+, it maybe doesn't make the hugest amount of difference. I guess it could be kind of relevant for things like modifiers, whereas if they still don't stack at all, then it could be relevant for a unit that's moving and firing with a heavy weapon. They'd now still potentially be taking the penalty of that modifier, where they wouldn't have before, as it would be double stacking negatives. Realistically, as with now, I think a lot of the time it's still going to make sense to move and fire heavy weapons. You often just need to get line of sight, or to get on objectives, or get behind cover. The damage output boost is nice if you can get it, though not always expected. Though it's going to be interesting to see the mentality shift, where a lot of Space Marines might be hitting on 2s with their bolters now apparently, unless they're assaulting and advancing towards the enemy. I do kind of wonder as well if certain ballistic skills might be kind of toned down to compensate. If Games Workshop did want to say Sisters still hitting on 3s if they're stationary, they could make their base ballistic skill a 4+ rather than a 3, and then just have the heavy keywords to get them back up to a 3 if they don't move. Not sure if that's going to be the way that they go, it doesn't seem to have been with the Space Marine bolter, but I guess that might work a bit differently as it's maybe not quite as traditionally a heavy weapon. Next up, we're getting into perhaps some of the more unusual 10th edition damage buffs. The first one I thought we'd talk about is Devastating Wounds, the one where on a wound roll of 6, instead of getting the weapon standard damage output, you get the equivalent of mortal wounds of that damage instead. So far the biggest gun that we've seen this in is the Space Marine Assault Cannon, where it really has the feel of the old Rending rule, plus the Librarian's Smite attack on high power mode, and his combi weapon. This is a rule that we have seen a few times before in 40k. The Imperial Knights have a big shooting stratagem that can trigger it, for example. And it's kind of interesting as it's a bit of a leveler. It makes guns pretty excellent against just about every target. For the most part, trading your damage out for mortal wounds is going to be most valuable on high toughness and high save enemies. And this rule in general I think will be more powerful on big multi-shot, low strength weapons, which might have lacked the AP to chew through enemy saves. Just for interest, here's the Assault Cannon calculated with and without the Devastating Wounds buff. Against a lighter target like that Orc Weird Boy that we saw with a 5+ save and toughness 5, overall he averages 2 wounds, and the Devastating Wounds rule basically adds 12% to the attack's damage, so not really all that much. Definitely not unhelpful, but he's going to get loads of wounds anyway, and with a pretty low armor save, those wound rolls of 6s were at least fairly likely to puncture armor already, whether or not they're mortals. Comparatively against a lot more armoured targets, Devastating Wounds is far more useful. Against the Space Marine Intercessor he averages 1.3 wounds, of which on average 1/3 of that are mortals. It adds 50% to the attack damage. Then going up against a Rhino, he averages just shy of 1 wound on a round of shooting. Devastating Wounds basically doubles the damage that he gets against that target, though it still doesn't mean that he's necessarily super efficient at shooting down tanks. Basically, the Assault Cannon as it stands is very good at chewing through light infantry, and Devastating Wounds allows it to be at least somewhat effective against tanks and things, due to casting a fair few mortal wounds along with all the volume fire. Basically, Devastating Wounds is very rarely ever going to be a bad rule to have, though it maybe helps out a lot more against targets that aren't really in your weapon's best characteristics to be shooting against. The same could be true of big anti-tank weapons, where if they roll a 6 and convert their damage to mortals, you might be able to kill a whole bunch of enemy infantry, whereas you might have only killed one with one shot. I feel like anything with Devastating Wounds is also going to really like full wound rerolls, things like Twin Linked or the Space Marine's Oath of Moment, both of which the Assault Cannon should be able to access on different platforms. 4 wound rerolls for the assault cannon means that if you're firing against a tough target, you can just literally reroll everything that isn't a 6 to wound and try and fish for those mortals to punch through damage against tough save targets. That seems at least fairly brutal for things like the Land Raiders twin-linked assault cannon as well. That could be kind of nice. It'll be interesting to see how this interacts with lethal hits as well. We don't have the full rule for that one yet. If lethal hits counts as a critical wound, then again this could be some pretty massive synergy, but again that's yet to be revealed. Speaking of which though, let's go on to lethal hits, which appears to be the new lieutenant rule. This one basically makes critical hits, so that's 6s to hit, automatically wound the target, though at the moment we don't know whether they also count as 6s to wound as well, which definitely has the potential to trigger other special rules such as devastating wounds as we've just seen. So far this one looks like it's a bit more of a buffing type rule. We've seen it on the Primaris Lieutenant and the Tyranids faction ability, the one where they get this against vehicles if they decide to specialise their high fleet against them. 6s to hit auto wounding really is quite a powerful move against tough targets. It's basically similar to the current guard Born Soldiers, and in terms of calculating its effect on damage output, it varies through a fair few things. It's basically better on things that have worse to hit rolls and worse to wound rolls, as that means that a greater proportion of the hits are going to be lethal hits, and then the lethal hits will actually matter more if you weren't going to wound your target anyway. Just for a couple of examples as to how impactful this could be for certain units, this is how much extra damage you'd expect for a lethal hits unit with a ballistic skill of 3+ or a ballistic skill of 4+, and then the further rolls are the to wound rolls that you'd need for their target. Say for example for a Space Marine unit who might be hitting their target on a 3+ and then wounding them on a 3, that'd give them a 12% increase in their damage output compared with what they'd have already. It's far more powerful though. Say if you had a Space Marine unit that was taking aim at something a bit tougher than they could usually handle and were wounding them on a 5, say some plasma going into a tough enemy tank for example, then in that case the lethal hits rule makes an absolutely massive impact on their damage output against those kind of targets, getting them an extra 50% extra damage. I'd bear in mind that the things that they're wounding on 3+ will generally be their optimal targets, so again kind of similar to devastating wounds, this is going to be a rule that maybe helps units punch through targets they're maybe not quite as used to dealing with, particularly low strength volume fire punching up against some of the toughest things in the game. A whole flurry of bolt rifle fire for example might just be a little bit more effective against a tough tank if you've got a decent amount of it auto wounding. If armies that hit on 4s can also gain access to this, it'll be even more impactful. Again, just because a greater amount of their hits that they can expect will be auto wounds. Theoretically, if you had a unit like Imperial Guardsmen who hit on 4s and might be wounding a tough target on 6s, they'd be getting well over double expected damage out of this rule, though admittedly their efficiency into those targets wouldn't have been good to start with. Overall, just based on this, the Lieutenant's damage buff is going to be a little bit underwhelming if you're going to be wounding your target on a 3, and even worse on a 2. But really quite nice if it's 4s or 5s. I feel like he's going to be more useful for a huge flurry of volume attacks, maybe things like power swords in combat, bolters, or perhaps plasma fire, which is going to be a bit more mid-strength now, as opposed to wounding vehicles on 3s. Should make units a bit more well-rounded and punch up against the heaviest things. Low-strength combat weapons with decent AP could also be really interesting for this. It'd also pair pretty nicely with things like Assault Intercessor chainswords, I guess. Next up, we've got the Twin Linked rule, a bit of a weird reimagination of the current Twin Linked system where you just get double the amount of shots. Now you just fire with a profile of a single gun, but that single gun gets to reroll wound rolls against its target. So far we've seen this on Tyranid Termagant Spine Fists, and also on these aggressor weapons with the Boltstorm Gauntlets, and it applies to both those and the Power Fists in combat. In general, 4 wound rerolls are going to be usually most impactful against things that will struggle to wound their targets, as if they're not, then buffing the wound roll isn't actually that big a deal. So again, probably maximally helpful on low strength weapons or against high toughness targets once more. Again, for percentage damage increase, it adds a lot less to Ballistic Skill 2+, only 17% as you're just re-rolling the 1s there. A solid 33% increase to weapons that wound on a 3+, a big 50% on a 4, and then higher numbers on a 5 and 6. Again though, I would bear in mind that things that wound on a 3 or 4 tend to be pretty efficient into their targets, so the buffs to them might actually be more meaningful than getting a big boost to something that was wounding on a 6, as usually that's not going to be the best gun to take down that target in the first place. In general, whichever way you look at it though, twin-linked weapons are looking like they're going to be a fair bit weaker than they are in their current edition. Basically getting double the shots is more powerful than any of these under any circumstances. Double the shots is plus 100% damage output, whereas this one varies between 17 and 83. Might be part of Games Workshop's overall tone down of lethality in 40k. Twin-linked units are maybe just going to be a little bit more on the durable tanky side, as opposed to mad damage dealers. In general, compared with their single weapon counterparts, they're just going to be a bit better at dealing with high toughness things. If they are costed just absolutely evenly for their damage output, twin-linked weapons would generally be expected to do a bit better into tough targets, and the single version should be more efficient into targets they already wound well. Obviously, any individual unit, depending on their points cost, might be better in the twin-linked or the non-twin-linked version, depending on how many points Games Workshop charge for them. It is kind of interesting as well that this rule looks like it's going to interact at least fairly strongly with a fair few of the other rules that we've had previewed, as it kind of has some perhaps unhelpful overlap. As mentioned, it looks like it will be extra nice for devastating wounds, where you could fully fish for mortals, it would seem. Reroll everything that isn't a 6 and hope for some big splash damage. On the other hand though, it works kind of poorly with things like lethal hits, which would skip the wound reroll and skip the benefit of the twin-linked weapon. And it's kind of interesting that it just completely overlaps with the Space Marine Oath of Moment. That will still help with the weapon's hit rerolls, but the full wound rerolls that gives will just basically be the exact same buff as the twin-linked weapon, so you're not going to get any benefit out of firing a weapon that's twin-linked against the Oath of Moment target. It may as well just have been a single one. In general, I feel like the theme of these as well is that there's quite a lot of abilities that really help out taking down tough targets. If lots of armies have access to different combinations of these keywords, it might be one of the better ways to deal with the new tougher vehicles that we get. I'd kind of hope that it maybe doesn't detract too much from taking dedicated anti-tank weapons, as is what seems to be Games Workshop are intending. I'm sure there's a pretty decent chance that we'll see some more general weapon keywords like this, but I'd say that perhaps those 5 are maybe some of the easiest ones to calculate increase in percent efficiency for. Though I suppose so far previewed we do have a few other classes, though whether or not it really makes sense to talk about percent changes is a bit more questionable perhaps. The anti-rule basically gives you a damage floor against their preferred targets. Chain Fists will always wound vehicles on a 3+, and the Librarian Combi Weapon will always wound infantry on a 4+ or better. It's pretty obvious with these ones, they'll just be very good at taking down tough targets that have their favoured keyword that they're firing against. Vehicles with the highest toughness aren't going to see any benefit from it against a Chain Fist. Otherwise, we've got Rapid Fire and Melter, which are basically the same as they are at the moment, at least for most purposes. Rapid Fire is basically double damage in half range and single damage at longer range, though they do have the ability to shake it up a bit, and the keyword now has a bit more flexibility, so it could fold in things like Orc Daka weapons. And Melter seems to be the same as it was in 9th, half range, and you get an extra damage boost for the Melter gun, plus 2 damage on a D6 Melter weapon. No one will care if you're firing against 1 wound infantry. It's a bit more reliable at punching through 3 wound infantry as you're not risking underkill, and it's a very meaningful damage boost against vehicles, being almost 60% extra damage compared with being outside of Melter range. Looks like it's going to be a little bit harder to achieve for the Eradicators though, only going down to 18-inch range with those Melter rifles. In any case, let me know what you think of the preview rules that we've seen so far. It's going to be fun to see how these actually apply to weapons and units in practicality. I do kind of feel that a lot of these seem geared towards making weaker things strong against high toughness targets though. Should be fun to see if that's actually efficient at taking down big vehicles with some good leadership and stuff. Hopefully we'll be getting a bunch more 10th rules inbound shortly with Games Workshop's big preview at the weekend, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. It's going to be good to take a look through the pieces of 10th edition and put them all together. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Making all these videos each day does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.